The gavel slammed down like a warning shot, and before Maya could even speak, the judge cut her off. "You're not here to speak. You're here to answer." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. A black woman, accused of treason, stood alone at the defense table. No lawyer, no notes, just a tired leather bag and eyes that didn't blink. The judge was white, cold, certain, and the cameras were already rolling. Maya didn't move. She didn't beg. She just whispered, almost too soft to hear, "Are you sure you want to do this?" That one question stopped everything. But it was too late, because what she was about to reveal would put the justice system itself on trial. If you're someone who still believes the truth matters, stay with me. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a reckoning. It was the kind of morning that felt like a warning. Gray skies, cold wind, the kind of silence in the air that made people whisper instead of speak. Outside Federal Courtroom 7, cameras clicked like insects. Journalists lined the hallway, phones glued to ears, voices low but urgent. "She's really coming alone? No legal team? Is she crazy or just guilty?" Then the doors opened, and Maya Thompson walked in. No entourage, no lawyer, just a navy blue coat too thin for the weather, a pair of shoes with worn soles, and a small leather bag slung over one shoulder. People leaned forward to get a look at her. This was the woman who, according to headlines, had leaked classified military files. They called her a traitor, a national threat, a disgrace. But she didn't look dangerous. She looked tired. She walked with a quiet kind of certainty, like someone who'd already accepted the worst. At the bench sat Judge Rachel Whitmore. White, composed, cold. A woman known for being by the book, the kind of judge who never raised her voice because she never needed to. The bailiff cleared his throat. "All rise." The courtroom stood. The judge nodded once. Everyone sat again, except Maya. She remained standing. The judge glanced up, eyebrows raised. "You may speak, Miss Thompson." Maya met her eyes, not with defiance, not with fear, just clarity. "I'm not here for mercy," she said. "I'm here for the truth." A murmur rippled through the room. Cameras tilted. Senators leaned forward. Even the court clerk looked up from her keyboard. No one knew what to make of her. No lawyer, no opening statement, no plea, just that one line. "I'm here for the truth." And suddenly, the question echoed across the courtroom. Why wasn't she defending herself? Why walk into the lion's den without armor? Unless she had something no one saw coming. Maya didn't rush. She simply reached into the worn leather bag at her side, slow, careful, like she was handling something alive. From inside, she pulled out a single piece of paper, folded, creased, corners soft from being opened and closed too many times. The ink was slightly faded, and one edge was torn, like it had been clutched too tightly by a grieving hand. She held it for a moment, let the silence return, then said quietly, "This was written by a woman named Clara Watkins." There was no reaction at first. No one knew the name. Maya continued, voice calm but tender. "Her son, Private First Class Elijah Watkins, never came home from a mission called Operation Blind River." Now the room stirred. That name, Blind River, had surfaced in whispers years ago. A mission redacted, details buried, families silenced. Maya looked down at the letter, her voice steady. "They gave me a folded flag, but no answers. They said it was an accident. They said it was protocol. But mothers know. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw their eyes avoid mine. I prayed someone, someday, would care enough to ask why my son died in a place he was never supposed to be." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the reporters stopped typing. Maya paused, looked out at the gallery, and that's when it happened. In the second row, to the left, an elderly man in a military blazer slowly bowed his head. His hand trembled as he wiped his cheek. A row of service ribbons shone faintly on his chest, and from somewhere deep in the gallery, a single, broken sob echoed. Not loud, but loud enough. The judge shifted slightly in her seat, uncomfortable. The prosecution whispered nervously. But Maya didn't react to them. She stayed with the letter, with Clara. "I don't want revenge," the letter continued. "I just want the truth. My son deserved at least that. He was 19. He still called me Mama when no one was listening. He had a laugh. He had a laugh that made the neighbors smile through the wall. And now, there's only silence." Maya's voice broke, not from theatrics, but from the unbearable weight of carrying someone else's grief. She folded the letter again, carefully, like she was tucking a memory back into place. And for the first time, The room no longer saw her as a defendant. They saw her as a messenger, a woman carrying a voice that had been ignored, dismissed, buried. And in that moment, it wasn't about secrets or charges. It was about a mother who buried a son with more questions than answers. Maya didn't look at the judge. She didn't look at the press. She reached into her bag again just as calmly, and this time pulled out a manila folder. The courtroom tensed. She held it in both hands, then stepped forward. "This," she said, "is the declassified after-action report from Operation Blind River." Murmurs immediately broke out. Reporters scrambled to adjust their lenses. A few legal analysts in the back leaned forward. Even Judge Whitmore narrowed her eyes, just slightly. Maya opened the folder and held up a printed page. It was covered in text, margins narrow, some sections still blurred, but most lines now fully visible. No more thick black redactions, only names, dates, and consequences. She began to read. Blind River was an experimental deployment, a field test for prototype defensive gear provided by Strat Defense Technologies. During live simulation, 4 U.S. soldiers experienced catastrophic equipment failure. 3 died instantly. 1, Private First Class Elijah Watkins, died from delayed trauma en route to medical. The report identifies mechanical malfunction as the primary cause. Not enemy fire, not battlefield risk, but faulty design. Gasps again. But Maya wasn't finished. She turned to the final page of the report, her voice lower now. Authorization for funding and field testing was signed by the Oversight Subcommittee Chair on National Security. She paused, looked at the judge for the first time. Chairperson Rachel Whitmore. The courtroom froze. All eyes turned to the bench. Judge Whitmore blinked. For the first time, she looked unsure. Someone in the audience whispered, "Wait, the judge signed that?" Maya didn't gloat. She didn't accuse. She simply placed the folder on the evidence table and said, before she was a judge, she was a decision maker, and this decision cost 4 lives. The air thickened. Tension built like thunder without the lightning yet. Judge Whitmore sat up straighter. "Miss Thompson," she said, voice tight, "this court is not here to retry military operations." Maya didn't respond. She just stood still. And for the first time, people started wondering what else was buried under the name Blind River. And more importantly, what else did the judge know? Before the murmurs had even settled, a quiet voice rose from the back of the courtroom. "I'd like to speak," the woman said. She stood slowly, one hand still gripping the pew in front of her. Her coat was plain. Her face lined not with age, but with exhaustion. A faded VA hospital badge still clipped to her pocket. Judge Whitmore adjusted her glasses. "Name and relevance?" She nodded once. "Susan Dyer, former Army nurse, stationed at Fort Brighton Medical. I was there the night they brought in Elijah Watkins." Silence fell again. The room seemed to pause mid-breath. Susan stepped toward the stand. Her walk wasn't confident. It was reluctant. Like every step toward that microphone was one she'd avoided for years. "I wasn't called," she said, "but I can't stay silent anymore." She rested her hand on the witness rail. It trembled. "That night, we weren't told anything, just that a transport was inbound. Classified injuries. No names, no unit, no context. But I remember what I saw." She exhaled slowly. "He was still breathing when they brought him in, Elijah. 19 years old. I remember his uniform was soaked, not with blood, but with rainwater and oil. His left hand kept twitching. His eyes never closed." Now, the courtroom leaned in, not out of curiosity, but instinct, as if to hold something fragile. There was no trauma surgeon on duty that night. He'd been reassigned. Cost-cutting, no explanation. The ER was short-staffed. 2 medics, 1 new intern, and me. She swallowed hard. Elijah kept whispering, same thing, over and over. "Does my mom know I wasn't supposed to be there?" His voice was so soft I had to lean close just to hear it. Her own voice cracked. He didn't ask if he'd live. He didn't ask if it would hurt. He only asked if his mom knew. She looked straight at the judge now. "He died 27 minutes after arrival. I remember because I never stopped looking at the clock. 27 minutes. That's all he had left." A single gasp came from the gallery. Someone sobbed quietly behind a row of reporters. Susan's hand pressed flat against the wood of the stand, her knuckles white, her face pale. "I told him she knew. I lied." Her voice dropped to a whisper. Because in that moment, hope was the only thing I had to offer him, and even that felt like a betrayal. She paused. Her eyes closed briefly, just enough to steady her voice. After his heart stopped, I sat in the supply closet and cried into my scrubs, because I knew what was coming. The sealed reports, the polished casket, the press release that said died honorably in service. Now she looked out at the courtroom. He didn't die because of war. He died because someone in an office said yes and never looked back. That line hit like a brick. Judge Whitmore's fingers curled slightly on the bench. One of the court reporters wiped their cheek. The gallery had gone so quiet, the soft hum of the lights overhead was now the loudest sound in the room. Maya stood motionless, but her eyes, they held something fierce and sacred, a kind of silent promise. Susan stepped back from the stand. "I'm not here to accuse anyone," she said. "I just needed someone, anyone, to finally hear him." And in that moment, Elijah Watkins was no longer a file, no longer a folded flag. He was a boy, asking for his mother. While the system looked away, for a moment it felt like the air itself had frozen. Susan Dyer's voice still lingered in the room like fog, quiet, heavy, refusing to lift. Maya stood motionless, no words, no movement. Then, with calm precision, she reached into her leather bag one last time. This time, it wasn't paper. It was something smaller, harder, colder, a silver USB drive. She walked toward the front of the courtroom, not looking at the judge, but at the people, the families, the veterans, the faces that weren't in headlines but had everything at stake. "There's one more thing you need to hear," Maya said quietly. "It's not a statement. It's not a theory. It's a voice." She turned to the bailiff. "If the court allows," she said, "I'd like to submit an audio file as evidence." Judge Whitmore sat up straight, eyes sharp. "You're not licensed to enter evidence, Miss Thompson." Maya looked at her, calm, clear. "Neither were they," she replied. "But they made decisions anyway." A long silence. Then, surprisingly, Judge Whitmore gave a single nod. "Proceed." Maya inserted the drive, the screen came to life, and then there it was, a voice, female, calm, confident, crisp like a cleanly ironed suit. "If the mother pushes too hard, paint her as emotional. That'll end it before it begins." The reaction was instant. Gasps, chairs shifting. One juror's pen fell from his hand and clattered to the floor. Another voice responded on the recording, softer, uncertain. "But what if she goes to the press?" The same woman replied, "Then we frame it as instability. Use the grief against her. The public believes what we tell them." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was deafening. The judge didn't speak. Couldn't. Because the voice, that crisp, calculated voice, was hers. People turned slowly to look at the bench. Judge Rachel Whitmore sat frozen, her jaw clenched tight, one hand gripping the edge of the bench so hard her knuckles turned white. Maya didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply said, "This meeting took place 4 months after Elijah Watkins died." That voice belongs to Judge Rachel Whitmore, then chair of the National Security Oversight Board. Shock rippled through the gallery like a wave hitting stone. A woman in the front row gasped aloud. A reporter in the back lowered her phone slowly, as if suddenly unsure what story she'd been covering. Someone whispered, "My God, she knew." Judge Whitmore's lips parted, as if she was going to deny it. But no sound came out. Only her breathing, shallow, uneven. One juror covered his mouth and looked away. Another stood and walked out quietly, tears in her eyes. It wasn't just scandal. It wasn't politics. It was betrayal. Of mothers, of soldiers, of the system, of the truth. Rachel finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that?" Maya looked at her for the first time with something close to sadness. "From someone who couldn't live with the silence anymore," she said. "One of your aides." She heard it. She kept it. And after Clara Watkins died, she couldn't carry the lie one more day. Judge Whitmore sank back into her seat. The courtroom held its breath. And Maya, she turned away from the judge, facing the people again. This wasn't a mistake. This was a strategy. They didn't just bury a mission. They buried a mother. Now her voice grew stronger, not louder, just firmer. They weaponized her grief. They called her unstable so they wouldn't have to call themselves responsible. A murmur spread, not confusion, not disbelief. Recognition. Because somewhere deep down, everyone in that room had seen it before, in the way grieving women were talked over, dismissed, called emotional, while they were actually brave. Maya looked toward the bench one last time. Judge Whitmore didn't fail to do her duty. She chose which truth the public deserved, and decided that pain was easier to manage when it came from someone who couldn't fight back. The judge said nothing, because in that moment, she was no longer above the court. She was under the weight of it, and for the first time since the trial began, no one was listening to her anymore. The courtroom was still buzzing, a low, unsettled hum from people trying to make sense of what they had just heard. But Maya, she moved differently now. No more evidence, no more folders, no more flash drives. She walked to the back of the room, quiet, slow. And when she returned, she was carrying something that made everyone go silent again. A wooden chair, old, worn, one leg slightly uneven. The finish had faded in patches. There was a long scratch across the backrest, and the seat dipped ever so slightly in the middle, like it had been sat in hundreds of times by the same person. She didn't speak at first. She carried the chair with both hands, as if it were fragile. Not just furniture, but memory. She placed it gently, right next to the witness stand, turned it toward the audience, then stepped back, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had ever been. "This," she said, "was Elijah's chair." People blinked, unsure what they were seeing, unsure if it even mattered. But Maya didn't need their permission. She continued, "He sat here for breakfast. He sat here for birthdays. He sat here the night before he shipped out and said goodbye to his mother." She placed her hand gently on the top rail of the chair, a gesture not of ownership, but of care. "It's just wood," she whispered. But it stayed empty, because someone signed a paper. No one moved, no one dared to, because this wasn't about justice anymore. This wasn't law. This wasn't revenge. It was something simpler, more devastating. Absence. The echo of a boy who would never come back to this chair. Someone in the gallery sobbed openly. A woman clutched her purse tightly against her chest. An older man, a veteran in uniform, bowed his head and wouldn't look up. Even Judge Whitmore was frozen. Her gaze fixed on the chair like it had just spoken. Because in some way, it had. Maya crouched beside it now, ran her fingers slowly over the edges of the seat, the kind of touch only a mother would recognize. The kind of reverence people usually reserve for gravestones. She said nothing for several seconds, letting the silence do what words couldn't. Then, we remember names, we remember missions, but we forget the seats they used to fill. She stood up, stepped back, and if we forget those seats, we'll forget who they were. Not just how they died, but how they lived. The courtroom was no longer a room. It was a sanctuary. The chair sat there, still, quiet, but louder than any argument ever made that day. Because it was proof, not of guilt, but of loss. And no one could deny it. The room had stopped moving. The chair still sat near the stand, old, empty, and somehow louder than any voice that had spoken all day. Maya stood beside it, one hand gently resting on the backrest. She hadn't moved since the last words left her mouth. She didn't need to. The silence was already doing the work. And then, a sound broke through. Not a gavel. Not a shout, just a small, unsteady voice. "Excuse me." It was barely a whisper, but it stopped the entire courtroom like a lightning strike. Everyone turned. A little boy had stood up from the front row. He looked no older than 9, maybe 10. Dark curly hair, big shoes, a shirt tucked into dress pants that didn't quite fit. His hands were clutched tight around something small. No one moved to stop him. Not the bailiff, not the judge, not even the clerk. Because they could all feel it. This moment wasn't on the schedule, but it belonged here. The boy stepped forward, slowly, nervously. He kept glancing toward a woman seated behind him, his mother maybe, but she didn't call him back. Her hand just rested over her heart, trembling. Maya turned when she heard the shoes. Her eyes widened. She knew him. Caleb Watkins, Elijah's little brother. He approached the witness stand like someone walking into a storm. His small hand lifted, and he opened his fingers. There, resting in his palm, was a silver medal, scuffed, edges dulled. The ribbon twisted, worn like it had been held too many times by hands too small to keep it from fraying. Caleb looked up at Maya, his voice barely holding steady. "My brother said," he paused, swallowed, eyes filling, "that if he died, someone would tell the truth." A hush wrapped around the courtroom again, tighter this time. "You did." Maya's lips parted. Her hands came up slowly, instinctively, like she wasn't ready to take what he was offering. Not because she didn't want it, but because she knew how much it cost. Caleb tried to untangle the ribbon. I'm not very good at this, he whispered, fumbling. A soft, breathy chuckle rose from somewhere in the gallery, the kind that only breaks through when something is too tender to hold inside. Maya knelt down. Her knees hit the polished floor as she met Caleb's eyes, her voice thin, cracked but warm. You don't have to be. He held out the medal with both hands. Maya took it carefully, as if it might fall apart. She stared at it. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't new. But it was the only thing left of Elijah that still had weight. Her fingers curled around it. And for the first time that day, Maya Thompson cried. Not the restrained tears of a public figure. Not a symbolic sob. But a real, open, trembling weep. The kind that comes only after carrying the grief of too many people for too long. The room watched in stillness. Even the judge didn't blink. Because in that moment, Maya wasn't just a witness. She wasn't a defendant. She wasn't a symbol. She was a promise. And that promise had just been handed back to her by a child too young to understand systems, but old enough to know when truth has finally arrived. She whispered, her voice shaky. Thank you. I'll keep it safe. Caleb nodded, one sharp, serious nod like a soldier. Then he turned, walked back down the aisle, climbed into his mother's lap, burying his face in her shoulder. And just like that, the loudest moment in the courtroom came from the quietest voice. One juror wiped their eyes with the sleeve of their jacket. A woman with gray hair clutched a photo of her own son to her chest. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Because the words didn't matter anymore. The truth had already landed. Not in a file, not in a report, but in the hands of a woman kneeling on a courtroom floor, holding the last memory of a boy whose death had been turned into protocol. And no ruling could change that. The courtroom was still. The gavel never struck again. The judge never called for recess. Because there was nothing left to say. No arguments, no closing statements, no dramatic final verdict. Only truth. It sat there quietly, in the empty chair, in the silver medal, and in the small tear-stained face of a boy who had given it away. That afternoon, as the sun began dipping behind the courthouse dome, Judge Rachel Whitmore stepped down from the bench. Not with defiance, not with protest, but with a letter in her hand, folded, typed, and trembling at the edges. She didn't speak to the cameras outside, didn't issue a press statement, but her resignation was made public within the hour. And the letter? It was only 3 paragraphs long, but it carried a weight the justice system hadn't felt in years. I believed procedure was protection, she wrote. I thought silence kept the country safe. But all it did was bury the wrong names. I cannot take back what was lost, but I will no longer stand in the way of what must now be revealed. I resign not in shame, but in surrender, because power means nothing when it can't look grief in the eye. The next day, national headlines lit up. Judge resigns after explosive trial, Blind River cover-up confirmed, Congress moves to act. And 1 week later, in a chamber usually known for gridlock, the Watkins Act passed unanimously, a law that would mandate full transparency and declassification of all military records relating to the death of U.S. service members. No more redacted pages, no more classified regret. It was the first bipartisan vote in years. Because this time, it wasn't about politics. It was about a chair left empty, and a mother buried without answers. Outside the courthouse, Maya didn't speak to the press. She didn't hold a press conference. Didn't raise her fist or smile for the cameras. She just walked through the long marble corridor, past the benches, past the people who once doubted her, and now watched her in reverent silence. When she reached the courthouse steps, the crowd outside parted like water. There were no chants, no protests, just quiet, powerful, collective quiet. Maya reached the bottom step and paused. Then, a little voice from somewhere in the crowd. Are you the truth lady? She turned. A small girl stood with her mother, maybe 7 years old. Curly hair, wide eyes, a crayon-colored sign in her hand that read, Thank you, Miss Maya. The little girl stepped forward timidly. Was it scary? She asked. Maya knelt down, her face still damp, her voice soft. Yes, she said. But sometimes the scariest things are the most important ones. The girl nodded slowly, as if storing the words deep inside. Then Maya smiled, gentle, unguarded. I'm not the truth lady, she said. I'm just someone who didn't give up. And with that, she rose, turned, and disappeared into the crowd. Not as a hero, not as a headline, but as a woman who walked into a courtroom with no defense and left with something far greater than a win. She left with her voice, and with it, she gave that voice to others. The cameras were long gone. The courtroom was empty. The headlines had cooled. Even the sidewalk outside the courthouse had been swept clean, as if the day had never happened. But Maya still felt it all. In her bones, in her breath. She didn't go to any interviews, didn't attend the vote on the Watkins Act, didn't watch herself on the news. Instead, she went home. A small apartment on the edge of the city, 3 flights up, no elevator. A chipped mailbox with her name handwritten in faded ink. Nothing had changed, except her. She reached her door just as the sun dipped low, casting warm gold across the hallway tiles. And that's when she saw it. A single envelope, taped gently to her door. No stamp, no return address. Just her name scrawled in a careful, shaky hand. Maya frowned, then slowly peeled it from the frame. The paper was soft, the corners folded. She opened it slowly like it might crumble. And when she read the first line, she had to lean against the door. Dear Maya, if you're reading this, it means you did it. Her eyes filled. You carried my voice when I couldn't. You stood when I had fallen. You spoke, not just for Elijah, but for every mother who was told to sit down and stay quiet. She wiped her face with her sleeve. I wanted to say thank you, not for fixing everything, but for refusing to forget. It was signed simply, Clara Watkins. No date, no fanfare. Just a woman's final words left behind in case someone actually made it through. Maya folded the letter carefully, pressed it against her chest, and for a long time, she didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just sat, back against the wall, sunlight stretching across the floor beside her. And in that silence, there were no medals, no podiums, no roaring applause. Just the sound of someone keeping a promise she had never been asked to make, but made anyway. Justice isn't always a verdict. Sometimes it's just someone brave enough to speak the truth, even when their voice is shaking.